G'day guys, welcome back to True Eagle. Today I thought I would do a video that I've been sort of promising for at least a week now around the Eagles coaching race. Who is going to coach this club in 2025 and beyond? I have delayed this video a little bit because I've been recovering from man flu. You can probably hear it in my voice. But this is probably a good time to take stock of the coaching race in general. Who are the leading candidates? Certainly things have shifted. I feel like we're getting a lot of fake news, a lot of conflicting stories at this time of year. I feel like we're probably down to about 4 or 5 major contenders at this point, and we're probably still a couple of weeks away from finding out who is going to be senior coach, for mainly the reason that a lot of the candidates were involved in finals. Now, a few of them have dropped out. Obviously, I'm recording this before the prelim final, so we got 4 teams left. And I just want to say that this is completely normal and in fact should be the situation. I've seen a little bit of conjecture out there that, we're sitting on our hands a little bit and we really need to nail down the senior coach soon. I actually feel like if we had picked a senior coach and locked him in at this stage already, I would have felt a little bit aggrieved that we hadn't done the process fully, considering a number of these candidates are still, involved in finals. So to summarize, we're probably down to Jared Scofield, if you include him, probably still technically in the race, certainly hasn't been ruled out. Hayden Skipworth, Stephen King, Brent Montgomery, Andrew McQualter are probably the 4 main ones. There's a little bit of a suggestion around Brendan Laade, so we can talk a little bit about these names and a few other bits. But out of curiosity, I went back and looked to 2013 when we replaced John Worsfold with Adam Simpson. John Worsfold stepped down, I think, September 12th, or something like that, right? Eagles weren't taking part in finals. John Worsfold stepped down. We replaced him with Adam Simpson on October 3rd. The reason being, Adam Simpson was involved at Hawthorn at the time as an assistant coach. Hawthorn were obviously involved in the 2013 grand final, so, about a week or so, a little bit less after that, is when we locked in Adam Simpson as senior coach. So my point being, we're still a few weeks away, and this is completely normal that we haven't locked it in yet. Now, let's talk about some of the candidates that we've heard are being linked to the role, and I feel like we've heard 3 or 4 different conflicting stories about who is the leading candidate. So I suppose my first piece of advice would be, let's just take a beat and wait for this to play out. And I personally am not choosing to get too caught up in who I want to be senior coach. As I've said before, I don't feel like any of us are particularly qualified. If I could sit into the interview process and listen to them talk, I'd probably have more of a strong opinion. But nonetheless, we're going to talk about what each coach brings to the table and their various likelihoods. So as we know, I think when we first started making content around this space, the leading contenders were Dean Cox, Ash Hansen, Jamie Graham, the 3 former Eagles that we thought, you'd imagine they'd go close. Well, all of them have ruled themselves out. Josh Carr was another one that ruled himself out. Jiren Syracuse, I believe, did. There was a bit of talk about Ken Hinkley. That seems to have died away. The latest article I found was that West Coast never approached Ken Hinkley, and even if they had, he was not interested in moving to Perth. So in this video, let's summarize just who we've got left, okay? We know about Scofield. I personally haven't completely lost faith in the idea of Scofield as our coach, but I'll admit it doesn't seem very likely at this point. We're really relying on, what the media is suggesting at the moment, and the talk around Scofield has died away, but there's no reason to suggest that even if he was a major contender, news outlets would even have any wind of that. So what do we get from Scofield? Well, I like his aggressive nature, in particular the way he gets the Eagles playing when they were playing well. What works against him is the last couple of weeks, obviously, where we fell away badly, but I'm unwilling to hold that against him in the same way that we probably shouldn't give him too much credit for the wins. We almost need to ignore his time as interim coach. It's more about what he brings, what are his values. Scofield has always been associated with good teams. What he did in the Waffle and driving the standards there is something that does appeal to me in terms of what he can bring to West Coast. I like that he's relatively young and a first-time senior coach. I do think that's probably going to be necessary for us. And I feel like the engagement with the players and the relationship that he seems to be able to build with players does work in his favour. So I am still completely open to the idea that Jared Scofield could be coach. But let's talk about some of the others. So the most recent major contender, the leading contender, is Hayden Skipworth, which, contradicts what we heard less than a week before where Will Scofield said, Stephen King, lock it in. And there's also been suggestion at various points that Andrew McQualter is now the leading candidate. So let's start with Skipworth. This broke yesterday, I think, on 7 News, and it says that Skipworth is actually the most likely to be appointed as the new full-time coach after the Eagles coaching selection panel were impressed with his focus on development, modern game plan principles, and player connection. So these are the big 3 really that we want. We want to build a cohesive, connected playing group. Simpson talked a lot about that, but you look at teams like Hawthorn right now, they're a very connected young group, and that is something that's going to be necessary not only to play well, but also player retention, right? You want to build culture, and play connection is a big part of that. Modern game plan principles is huge. You want to be a little bit ahead of the competition tactically. I'd rather have a coach that has a proven competence at modern day strategy and tactics like that. So again, it's all very vague, but that is something that apparently is associated with Hayden Skipworth, and development is another big one. I think he was involved at Collingwood's Talents Academy, obviously working with younger prospects there, helping them develop. We're about to become a very young list. We're sort of getting that way already. So that kind of makes sense. So, on paper, Hayden Skipworth has what West Coast are looking for. He's also been involved at Collingwood since 2020, so he's seen it all. In 2021, they finished second last. Then they bounced back to a prelim and then became premiers in 2023 and worked closely with Craig McRae. So all of that is a big tick. So on face value, Hayden Skipworth seems like a good prospect. Let's move down to Stephen King. Now, analysing this a little bit, this was sort of interesting how this story kind of broke. And as far as I can tell, this really just come from Will Scofield being interviewed and saying that he thinks Stephen King is locked away as the man. I'll quote, he says, "Stephen King, he's the man that I'm hearing is the number one target for the West Coast Eagles. King would be the number one guy for mine. I don't think they're looking at anyone else. It's a coach that's coaching in finals right now with Geelong at present." So this one seems odd. I mean, the benefit that Will Scofield has is you can imagine he's probably somewhat well connected. This is quite a sensitive thing for him to have information about. However, I don't think he's a dishonest guy, Will Scofield, by any stretch. So he's certainly implying that he's got some information that Stephen King is the number one target. I do find it odd that he says that he doesn't think West Coast are looking at anyone else. I just don't believe that to be the case. Well, we know that's not the case because this story has been superseded by the fact that Hayden Skipworth is now apparently the leading contender. Maybe I'm taking Scofield too literally there, but I find it curious that Scoey would have insight like that. And it also just doesn't quite sit right with me that West Coast has kind of made up their mind before they've interviewed everyone. Who knows? And like I said, I don't think Will Scofield is necessarily like a dishonest guy by any stretch of the imagination, unlike some other journos. But whether or not his mail here is correct, I'm a little bit skeptical at this point in time that West Coast has decided on Stephen King. But on King, I mean, like I said, he's involved at the Cats right now, which is a great place to be involved. I mean, I think as it currently stands, probably the most likely to win the premiership, considering the grand final will be at the MCG. Even if they play Sydney, you'd think they'd probably start favourites. So he's involved in a successful setup, and obviously Chris Scott is one of the best coaches of the modern era. Coaching experience at 4 clubs. He did an interim stint with the Gold Coast Suns. That was that last year? Wow. He was also involved at St Kilda in 2010 and 11. St Kilda were good in 10, fell away in 11. And the Bulldogs from 2011 to 2021. So that's probably good because the Bulldogs went through a period of being competitive and then rebuilt, and then obviously won the premiership in 16, fell away again, made a grand final. So again, it's the spectrum of experience there that I think is helpful. I personally think it's good if whether it be a football coach or anyone in business, has been exposed to environments where things are going well and where things are going poorly, rather than just one or the other. Certainly you wouldn't want to hire a coach who's only been at a terrible club. Either way, his resume stacks up. As for anything else about him, again, we're a little bit in the dark here. So let's talk about Andrew McQualter as well. The talk about him has been a little odd. So I'll be specific. He's currently an assistant coach at Melbourne. He was interim at Richmond last year and won 7 games and lost 6 before the club ultimately decided to go Adam Uze permanently. The only insight I can really find on McQualter is that he is described as being in the Craig McRae mold, which is, particularly around forming relationships. And like I said, when we were talking about Skipworth, this is critical in coaching, right? So 7-6 record's good. Again, you can only take so much from an interim stint. But I did kind of laugh at this. This is from Jay Clark from the Herald Sun. He was talking on Fox Footy's midweek tackle, and he says that McQualter's relationships at Richmond could potentially help the Eagles land their trade and free agency targets. So he says, McQualter is an intriguing one given his links to Liam Baker and Jack Graham. He says if McQualter gets the West Coast job, it could be a defining thing which helps get Baker and Graham over the line at West Coast. So now that I read it back, he could just be simply saying that this could benefit West Coast in some way, but I sure hope he's not implying that that would help McQualter get the job. We wouldn't pick our senior coach just because it helps us get Jack Graham and Liam Baker, right? But either way, those do seem to be the primary 3 candidates. You got Skipworth, Stephen King, and McQualter. Brent Montgomery as well. This story has fluctuated. Once upon a time, he looked like a major contender. Then there was some doubt about whether he was going to apply at all, but I believe he is still in the race, and GWS's finals run has just ended. So you'd imagine if West Coast is serious about it, this week will be big in terms of canvassing A, his interest, and B, that interview process, etc. So Montgomery is involved in GWS. He was part of a new look coaching group under Kingsley, which went on to reach a preliminary final in their first year together. Remember, Kingsley took them from, were they bottom 4 the year before? Yes, in fact, they were 16th, and he took them to the prelim final in their first year. So again, a coach that has been involved in a group that is improved quickly. He is currently the Giants backline coach. The Giants have had a pretty good backline there. Again, a lot of talent in there as well. But he's worked at Carlton, the Western Bulldogs, and Port Adelaide, and he's been an assistant coach for over 13 years. He's described as a great teacher, builds connection with his players. They all love him, and he's an educator, and he's accountable. So again, a lot of the same sort of buzzwords we're hearing about a variety of these candidates. I did also read that the Crows are also working very hard to poach him. He would be South Australian originally. I think his son might get drafted to Port Adelaide this year. Possibly. He's certainly father-son eligible. So again, I think it's the cultural aspect of being involved at GWS, and again, described as a fairly good tactical brain. So a lot of these guys have a lot in common. Another name that hasn't quite gone away in this coaching process has been Brendan Laade. Now, I don't know a whole lot about Brendan Laade. I do vaguely remember him as a player for Port Adelaide, but he's involved at the Western Bulldogs since 2022, and he's been coaching for about 14 years. And again, not a major contender if you follow the flow of what the media are saying. Never been named as a leading contender, but nonetheless, his name hasn't gone away. So worth contemplating as well in the background there. But to talk about Danny Daly, this story it emerged about a month ago, and then it sort of went away, and I found a little bit more on it. So apparently West Coast is chasing Danny Daly to be its new football director and head of coaching. The Eagles originally targeted Danny Daly to be the senior coach, or at least, contemplating him as an option, whereas that seems to be more moved to be more of a footy boss role now. Now, I'm not too sure if this is going to be replacing someone like a Gavin Bell. I forget Gavin Bell's current role at West Coast. Is it like head of football or something like that? You'd imagine you wouldn't have a football director and head of coaching and a head of football operations. But Danny Daly is currently at Brisbane in the same role, and apparently has been Chris Fagan's right-hand man since 2020. So again, really good organisation to be involved in. Brisbane have been successful. We know Fagan has been, a huge part of turning around the Brisbane Lions from 2019. Bit on the older side, Danny Daly, but again, not as senior coach. He will be, in theory, more of a head of football operations role, or whatever the hell the title's going to be. Naturally, Brisbane's still involved in the finals. They got a prelim against Geelong this weekend, so the conversation will be part for the time being. According to Jay Clark, the Eagles want him essentially to be a footy director and head of coaching, to sit above the footy manager. Okay, so I answered my own question there. So if you've got a football manager, I presume that's going to be Gavin Bell, unless they decide to move him on. That tends to happen when, your team goes to shit and you make wholesale changes. Gavin Bell may or may not survive, but you could in theory have Danny Daly, then Gavin Bell, and then the new coach. He then goes on to say, in all likelihood, they're going to appoint a very young, inexperienced senior coach. Now, again, I don't know if that's conjecture based on opinion, but in theory, all of these coaches are somewhat inexperienced. I suppose you got Stephen King and McQualter, who have been interim coaches before, but never having actually had a full-time coaching role. So there you go, guys. I'd love to sit here and campaign for one of these options over the other. To be honest, I'm just remaining open-minded. I don't even know who to suggest is the leading contender at the moment. I do remember considering Skipworth a good match for us like a month ago when I did a video on this. So perhaps, I'd be interested in him. Jared Scofield, I still have faith in, but I ultimately will defer to the decision-making process and those charged with this decision at West Coast, because the last time we were in this situation, they did very well getting Adam Simpson. So we'll see what happens, but let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.